All eyes are on China. From human rights violations, religious persecution, the detainment of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, the preparations of the Beijing Olympics, and most recently, the virtual disappearance of tennis star Peng Shuai. Those watching closely wonder what it will take to stop this global power from rising. This comes as calls heighten for boycotts of the upcoming Beijing Olympic Games due to the human rights abuses, of which there are many in China. The International Olympic Committee admitting holding China to account is out of their jurisdiction.
The situations that you've referred to, the humanitarian ones in China, is not within our remit.
This while Uyghur Muslims are placed in re-education camps, working in forced labor, the women sterilized, their children ripped from their families. Canada and the US, along with many human rights organizations, have called it a genocide. And Chinese Christians continue to be persecuted. Government officials shut down more than 100 churches in 2020, even while many continue to join underground churches, risking imprisonment. But as the human rights abuses continue, the global community can't ignore China's economic superpower, with experts saying China could have the world's largest economy as early as 2030. So what is the recourse? How does the world hold China accountable? On today's Context, the rise of China. Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. Jia Wang is the interim director at the China Institute at the University of Alberta, a think tank that looks at the global influence of the rise of China economically, politically, and culturally. She joins me from Edmonton. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start here in Canada. How reliant is Canada on China for trade? And does this relationship make it hard for Canada to hold China accountable for its actions on the world stage?
Well, Canada, first of all, is a very dependent on trade, global trade. And of course, US is our number one trading partner, but China is the number two. So it is a major trading partner for Canadian goods and services.
And so what does that relationship look like when it comes to holding China accountable for what we've just listed at the beginning of our show, some of the human rights allegations that have been put forth?
Well, Canada will have to manage this complex relationship carefully and very thoughtfully. As we all know, China is increasing in its economic might and also its global presence. So for Canada, China will remain to be an important trading partner, and probably that the percentage of trades between Canada and China would even increase over time. But there are also other issues, political issues, and of course, China's certain human rights abuses within its borders, and some of the security issues in the region as well. And I think really Canada is a middle power, so it doesn't carry as much clout as the United States. So, but we have to understand where China is coming from. We have to understand where China's strength is. But also China is hoping to have a good international environment for its own development. And it cares about its reputation as well.
Right.
So that provides space for Canada to use our middle power, I guess, to basically, push China on certain fronts and encourage China to really work hard on the human rights issues within its borders.
There have been talks about diplomatic boycotts of the Beijing Winter Olympics. What message, if any, will that send to China if it is boycotted?
Well, diplomatic boycott, of course, it's different from a total boycott.
Yes.
We're still sending the athletes over because they have been working so hard for that game, and we don't want to see their dreams of competing dashed. But in terms of diplomatic boycott, I think the U.S. talked about it. It's basically they're not going to have any senior officials attending the Beijing Olympics, and I think that's possible, and that's likely that's going to happen to many Western countries.
It's been a tough 3 years with the detainment of the Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig while Meng Wanzhou awaited extradition hearings. What has happened to the diplomatic relationship between the two countries in that time, specifically Canada and China? How have you seen that relationship maybe change or maybe also be strained as well?
Well, the diplomatic relationship between Canada and China is really at a historic low, especially before the two Michaels were sent home, and the diplomatic relationship hasn't been that fraught for many decades. So it is definitely at a low point. So many would argue because it's at a very low point, so it has nowhere to go but improve. But that improvement will not likely to be very fast because the public opinion in Canada still sees China very, very negatively. You know, given the importance of China on the global stage and how important it is how important it is that this country is affecting us, whether we deal directly with the country or not, when it comes to global climate change issues, for example, and other global pandemic issues, and then also economic issues, because China is so integrated within the global supply chain. We cannot really easily untangle that relationship.
A lot of diplomatic maneuvering through it all. Last question for you. You say China is a major trading partner to 120 countries. Given its rise as an economic superpower, will China change its ways on human rights abuses, or does it already have so much power that it doesn't matter what other countries think?
Well, sometimes it's worthwhile looking at China's way of thinking. We don't have to agree with it, but it may be helpful to understand where they're coming from. China, when they look at human rights issues, it mostly treat that as a domestic issue. So it sees the threat of the Communist Party of China, the ruling party. It sees the threat to its power or threats to stability of the society as the primary concern or the primary threat, not international threat. And it really doesn't like other countries to criticize China about it. But I think it is for the international community, you know, we would like to see human rights standards improve in many countries, including China, of course. And I think that pressure should be on continuously, and also hopefully with persistent pressure, but also allies, having actions together that will bring more incentives for China to make those changes.
All right, Jia Wang, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, allegations of millions of Uyghur Muslims detained against their will, Chinese Christians persecuted, churches burned down, human rights violations. We hear from one expert who explains why there seems to be no recourse for this superpower.
In our fast-paced world, context is everything to the stories that are shaping us. We want to go beyond the headlines in our new podcast to create space for meaningful conversations, to explore where faith intersects with justice, ethics, culture, and society. We'll be joined by newsmakers, peacemakers, and culture shapers. Join us on all podcast platforms or at contextbeyondtheheadlines.com.
Human rights violations in China are well documented, and for religious people in China, the risks of practicing religion are real. Azim Ibrahim is a director at New Lines Institute and a columnist at Foreign Policy, where he wrote about the state control over religion in China. He joins me now. Thank you so much, Azim.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Azim, what does the Chinese state control over religion mean?
So, Maggie, since Xi Jinping came to power, one of the things that he's been trying to enact is to create a unified identity in China. He's doing this because he doesn't want any other identity or any other philosophy or religion or any ideology to rival the Communist Party. The Communist Party has to be the sole identity within China. So he's undertaken a process of suppressing religions, not just the Uyghurs and the Muslim, but also Christianity. They've demolished, for example, over 100 Christian churches. They've demolished Buddhist temples, and they're essentially trying to wipe out all religions so that the Communist Party reigns supreme.
Wow, over 100 churches have been wiped out. You write that since 2018, between 5,000 and 10,000 Christian churchgoers have been arrested, and 2/3 of China's Protestants have moved to underground churches to avoid police harassment. This is not new, but why the constant crackdown specifically on Christianity?
Well, it's not, as I said, it's not just Christianity. They're targeting all religions. But I believe Christianity is actually favoured in terms of the crackdown, because it is one of the things that the Communist Party has been careful to do is that they don't want anything to rival their ideology. The Communist Party is essentially morally vacuous. You know, they have realized that the only philosophy that they're promoting is to make money, is to make the economy grow, and for everybody to climb up the career ladder. So there's no actual moral basis behind their philosophical underpinnings. And Christianity, I believe, is the only alternative that can fill that vacuum, which is why they've targeted Christians and Christianity much more vociferously than many of the other ideologies. But they're targeting essentially anything, everything and anything that could rival communism. But Christianity has been picked out specifically because it can fill this moral vacuum. It can offer an alternative vision for the country, which is a real threat to Xi Jinping and to the leadership.
Why is there no recourse for what is happening currently in China when it comes to the persecution of the Uyghurs, and it comes to the persecution of Christians and other religious groups?
Well, that answer to that is relatively straightforward. China is a major global economic power. It's expected to overtake the United States, within the next 10 to 20 years. And unfortunately, there are many people who have invested very heavily in China. Many Wall Street bankers, many of our corporations and institutions are very heavily invested in China. A good example of this, Maggie, is Hollywood, our largest cultural export. They will never criticize China. They will simply never speak up because the Chinese market is far too important for them. Is actually bigger now almost in the US market. So money is a key driving factor in which we have many individuals and corporations have sold out their values in exchange for the Chinese yuan.
Wow. Money over people. Thank you so much, Azim Ibrahim, for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Maggie.
My next guests know intimately the issues and dangers Christians face in China. Brent Fulton is the founder of China Source, a platform designed to educate on issues concerning the church in China. And Bob Fu is one of the leading voices on the persecuted church in China, having led a house church in Beijing when he, along with his wife, were imprisoned for 2 months for illegal evangelism. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie, for having us.
Bob, I want to start with you. We're hearing more about the rise in China's power globally in the socio-political realm. What does this mean for the church in that country?
Well, Maggie, the rise of China is also coupled, of course, with both the rapid growth and also the increasing persecution among the churches. I mean, we have seen and in the past 6-7 years, the kind of persecution against the Chinese church has risen to a level that we have not seen since really the end of Cultural Revolution. And but at the same time, the dynamic of the church has still growing very fast, even despite of this the persecution context.
Yeah. With growth comes also the danger of more persecution. Brent, we hear that over 100 churches have been destroyed. And as Bob just said, yet the church keeps growing. There are more Christians than members of the Communist Party. Why do you think that is? Why is the church continuing to grow when there is so much danger?
Well, when Deng Xiaoping came into power in the 1980s, he unleashed a tide of reform and economic growth, but he never really answered the question of what should we as Chinese people believe in. And throughout history, China has had a particular belief system, whether it's Confucianism or Buddhism or Mao himself, communism. But in recent decades, that question has gone unanswered, and it's led a lot of people on a spiritual search. And I think one particular incident was in the 1980s, following the time of political demonstrations, which were then crushed by the government. Many young people at that time really were disillusioned with their country and disillusioned with communism, and they went on a spiritual search. For many of them, it resulted in them coming to the Lord. And a number of those people ended up founding small fellowships, which then became churches in cities around China. And you had a new movement of the church given birth during those decades.
Bob, Radio Free Asia reported that authorities in China are detaining Christians in secretive mobile transformation facilities to make them renounce their faith. One account we read stated that a man was held in a windowless room for nearly 10 months, during which time he was beaten, verbally abused, and mentally tortured by staff, eventually resorting to self-harm by throwing himself against a wall. What do you know about this type of treatment that especially Christian leaders are facing in that country?
Yes, it is now, unfortunately, becoming more and more common to see, with this, I call it rule of a lawless society under President Xi Jinping, unlike his previous two predecessors, who we usually describe as the rule by the law. At least there is some letter of the law. And the arbitrary detention, the enforced disappearance has become a norm. I mean, we have seen one of the most prominent Chinese human rights Christian lawyers, Gao Zhisheng, twice nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, had been disappeared by August for 4 years. Still, there's no word about his whereabouts, dead or alive. And we have seen we just found in the past 2 years, their church pastors also, some were arrested and under this enforced disappearance for 2 years, to several months, as you described. It is really a society quickly coupled with the digital authoritarianism and the face recognition cameras, the surveillance, really a police state. So this has not only happened to the unregistered church leaders, but also to other religious minority groups. I mean, you have heard and seen that in West China, called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, according to the estimate by the Pentagon, between 1 million to 3 million predominantly ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and even some Han Chinese, Muslims, Christians alike, had been in this over 380 modern day concentration camps. Basically, adults and children, as many are the whole village families, had been disappeared, vanished in these camps. So this is really a very sad time and a very urgent time of human rights and religious freedom crisis. Since the Cultural Revolution, are forced to sign a Communist Party prepared form to renounce their faith. And their colleagues, their teachers, their students are encouraged with the monetary incentive to report so-called illegal religious activities or self-proclaimed itinerant evangelists with up to 100,000 equivalent US dollars to do that. So this is what's happening now.
All right. Thank you so much, Brent Fulton and Bob Fu, for your time today.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
The Vatican's deal with the Chinese government, persecution of Christians, silence from the global community. What is the role of the global church when it comes to the atrocities happening on Chinese soil? The Q panel weighs in.
We are an undeniable voice, but we are not political. We are media missionaries.
The Q panel is back, and we're continuing the conversation we've been having throughout this show about China. Moira, Jackie, and Brian join me. We have known about the persecution of Christians in China for many years and state-run churches. Why does this continue to go on without any recourse? Brian.
Well, I think there's a sort of dominant narrative in the Chinese constitution and then their political situation in which everything must be done in the service of the nation. And I think what has happened is that they've realized that Christianity and other religions actually have commitments that transcend that. And so the government has for a long time tried to suppress those commitments, tried to get people to change them, and have done everything from imprisonment to sort of violence to get people to do that. And they've always failed. And so what's interesting is that you've had a situation in which you have groups of communities like Christians who are quite content to live within the Chinese culture, the Chinese nation, but you have a nation that's not content to let that diversity exist within it. And I think that's the ongoing tension, and one that probably won't get resolved until the Chinese state actually comes to grips with what it means to be a pluralist nation. And it's a hard thing to do, but I think it's an extremely important one.
Do you think that will happen, though, Brian? I feel like that's something that will never happen, where the Chinese state is going to come to terms with pluralism within their country.
Well, I think pluralism is a given fact. The question is whether or not they're actually going to adapt their institutions to recognize that and to not suppress it.
We are seeing the church in China grow, which is quite interesting under persecution. Jackie, of course, Christians aren't the only religious group being persecuted in China. We've heard of the Uyghur Muslims. Canada is only second to the U.S. in accusing China of committing genocide. Why aren't more countries joining this?
It is a genocide that's happening there. It's really unfortunate that the entire world has turned its eye and that we've turned our backs against these people who are suffering. And the same way that we are concerned about Christians and everything that we're seeing unfold with churches happening, that's happening right now in China, we need to be concerned as well about what's happening to the estimated at least 1 million Uyghur Muslims that this is happening to. That is just on such a massive scale. I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. And I think it is our obligation as humans and as Christians to show that solidarity with other groups, regardless of what their faith background is. If we want people to be concerned about persecution that happens to us, we must be extremely concerned and show that solidarity when it happens to them. I come from a persecuted minority group. I'm Coptic Christian from Egypt, and we are discriminated against and have, we've been through this for hundreds and hundreds of years in our own country. And this is the same message that I always tell my community. We are obviously upset about, what's happening with us. And so we really must, when things are unfolding globally, show that solidarity to other communities and other minorities, because religious persecution happens across the board, not just for Christians, it's across the board. And so we have to learn how to show that solidarity as well.
So well said. And, you know, I think of, I share this story a lot. I remember going to the Genocide Museum in Rwanda and weeping as I walked through this museum that's connected also to the UN Museum, and thinking to myself, why does this continue to happen? And there was a statement on the wall that said, let this not happen again. And yet we are currently living and watching genocide actually happen in a country, knowingly happen in another country, and we are not speaking about it as much as we need to. So absolutely, I agree. Moira, in 2018, a deal was made between the Vatican and the Chinese government. It called for China to formally recognize the Pope's authority within the Roman Catholic Church and his final appointments of the country's bishops. The Vatican, in turn, recognized the bishops previously appointed by the Chinese government and those excommunicated by the church. Should the church be making agreements with a government that is openly persecuting Christians, Catholics, or others, not to mention their long list of human rights infractions?
It's a wonderful question, and I think the straight off the top answer would probably be no, but the straight off the top answer isn't always the correct one, especially in this type of, let's call it political religious situation, as much as it is, certainly religious. And myself, I'm in two minds about that. My immediate reaction would be, you don't mess with people who ignore human rights. The other side is, though, that there are many Catholics and other Christians in China and Hong Kong, Taiwan, and there's a responsibility towards those people, and not just Catholics, of course, but the Pope is willing, I think, to keep some kind of bridge open, some kind of dialogue. Whether or not that works out to be justified over the next 2 years, because the agreement was extended for 2 years, I don't really know. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball in that. All I do think is, it seems to me that it's better to keep some kind of dialogue than cutting off completely, because to me, that would seem as if we were actually abandoning Catholics and other Christians and other faith groups actually in China itself. So of course it's complicated and no straightforward answer at all.
I'm always in awe when I hear the stories of those who currently live in danger because they worship Jesus. And yet the church continues to grow in the face of that very danger. And at the same time, we in the Western world have been afforded the freedom to worship freely without the fear of death or torture. And then there are millions of Uyghur Muslims detained against their will in re-education camps being used for forced labor, women being sterilized, and yet the country where this is happening continues to grow in power. Who holds them accountable? And what is the recourse? Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 to 12, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think of today's topic. Join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing Context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.